The day I signed the papers for that skeletal remains of a 1923 fisherman's shack, I didn't realize I was buying a front row seat to a 30-year war, but looking back now, I think that cabin knew exactly what was coming long before I did. Most people look at a lake and see a vacation, a place to park a jet ski and drink a lukewarm beer, but when I looked at Blackwood Shore, I saw a place to bury the noise in my head after the accident that took my partner and left my workshop feeling like a tomb. I'd spent 20 years as a master carpenter, a man who spoke through the grain of white oak and the smell of fresh cedar. But after the funeral, the tools felt like lead in my hands, and the air in the city felt like it was running out. So I took my savings and bought the one place nobody wanted, because it looked like it was one stiff breeze away from becoming a pile of kindling. It sat on a jagged little thumb of land, separate from the manicured lawns and the step-forward wife perfection of the Highland Crest Homeowners Association, or the Viper Pit, as the locals called it, where the grass is measured with a ruler and the souls are measured by the price of their patio furniture. I spent the first month just listening to the house breathe, prying up floorboards that hadn't and oppos, seen the sun since the Great Depression, and finding treasures tucked into the insulation. Old tobacco tins, a pair of rusted spectacles, and a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost for good. But the silence didn't end oppos. Last, because perfection is a jealous god, and the people across the property line at Highland Crest didn't like that my eyesore was ruining the view from their infinity pools. It started with the joggers, those lean, athletic types who would slow down just enough to grimace at my sagging porch, and the paddleboarders who would drift so close to my dock I could hear them whispering about, property values, sanitary hazards, I ignored them, mostly because I was too busy driving new pylons into the lake bed, my muscles screaming and my skin stained with silt, feeling more alive than I had in years. I even found an old branding iron in the mud, a heavy piece of iron with the numbers 1923 forged into the end, and one night, under a sky so clear it felt like I could touch the stars, I heated that iron until it was glowing like a dying sun and pressed it into a fresh slab of cedar. The hiss of the wood and the smell of the smoke felt like a baptism, like I was finally giving the cabin its name back, and I mounted that sign right above the porch as a middle finger to the rot and the silence. Then came the first envelope, a thick cream-colored thing that felt like it was made of money and malice, delivered by a woman named Beatrice Vane, the self-appointed queen of the Highland Crest Board. She didn't knock. She just stood there on the edge of my dirt driveway, looking at my mud-caked boots like I was something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe, and handed me a notice of aesthetic noncompliance, It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive literature, listing my, unregulated lighting, my, non-conforming dock structures, and my, unauthorized historical signage, which she claimed created, status confusion, for the community. I looked at her, this woman with a haircut that cost more than my first truck, and I told her as politely as a man like me can manage that my deed didn't have her name on it and my land didn't in oppos have her rules on it. She just gave me this thin, sharp smile that didn't in oppos reached her eyes and said, everything on this lake reflects on us, Mr. Miller, and we have a very long memory when it comes to reflections, 2 days later, I woke up to find two men in tactical khakis standing on my dock, looking like they were preparing for a beach landing in a suburban war zone. They had, Highland security, patches on their shoulders and radios that chirped like angry birds, and they were busy marking my shoreline with pink tape as if they were measuring me for a coffin. When I walked down there, phone recording and my heart thumping a steady rhythm of, not today, The taller one told me they were, clarifying the shared utility corridor, and that my dock was technically encroaching on Highland Crest and Oppos, jurisdictional visual zone. I laughed a real, belly-shaking laugh, and told them that unless they were the ghost of the surveyor who drew these lines in the 20s, they were trespassing on private property, but they didn't in oppos flinch. They just dropped a, red stamp notice, on my dock, a fine for $5,000 for, unauthorized shoreline modification, and walked away like they owned the air I was breathing. I headed to the county archives the next morning, my jaw tight and my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard I thought it might snap. And that's where I met Arthur, a guy who looked like he had been born and raised in a room full of dusty paper and dim light. He started digging through the old plat maps, his fingers dancing over the vellum. And then he stopped, his brow furrowing as he pulled up the digital GIS records for my section of the lake. He looked at me, then back at the screen, and said, and quote, "That's strange. The boundary on the public site was updated 2 weeks ago. It's got a curve in it now that clips your dock, but the hard copy historical master doesn't in Oppos. T show that at all." End quote. He dug deeper into the metadata, and there it was, a revision submitted by a and quote, B Vane admin and quote, account, bypassing the standard secondary review because it was labeled as a and quote, correction of a clerical error, end quote, Beatrice had used. Her position on the regional planning committee to literally move the earth on paper, redrawing the map of the world to make me a criminal in my own backyard. But the real gut punch came that night. I was sitting in the cabin, the only light coming from a small fire in the hearth, when I heard a sound like a dry branch snapping, followed by a sudden, violent flicker of orange outside my window. I ran out onto the porch just in time to see the shadows of 2 figures vanishing into the tree line, and my heart shattered when I looked up and saw my end quote. 1923 end quote. Sign engulfed in flames. They hadn't into Oppos. T just set a fire. They'd used an accelerant, something that smelled like kerosene and hatred, and the heat was already licking the original timber of the house. I fought that fire with a garden hose and a bucket, the smoke stinging my eyes and the ash coating my lungs. And when it was finally out, the sign was a charred husk, and the wall of my home was scarred with a jagged, black mountain range of burntwood. I stood there in the dark, soaking wet and shaking with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins, and I realized that these people didn't end Oppos. T just want my land. Hiding under their polo shirts and their polite smiles was a predatory hunger to erase anything they couldn't end Oppos. T control. The next morning I didn't end Oppos. T called the police. Arthur had already told me the sheriff wouldn't end Oppos. T touch and quote, boundary dispute and quote, until the courts weighed in. Instead, I went back to the archives and asked for every file on the property before 1990. That and Oppos. That's when I found the ghost of Elias Thorne. Elias had owned my cabin for 40 years, a man the records described as a and quote, litigious nuisance and quote, but when I read the transcript from 1988, I saw a hero. He'd fought a 4-year legal battle against the founding board of Highland Crest, and he'd won a permanent, non-expiring judicial injunction that barred the HOA from ever claiming jurisdiction or visual easement over Blackwood Shore. I tracked down his nephew, a man living in a trailer 2 towns over, and he handed me a rusted metal lockbox that had been sitting in his shed for decades. Inside was the original court-stamped surveyor's map, a handwritten letter from Elias detailing every bribe and threat the HOA had ever made, and a photograph of the board members from the 80s, including a much younger Beatrice Vane, looking exactly like the kind of person who would burn a man in Oppos, S-house down to save her view. The end quote, arbitration hearing and quote, was held at the Highland Crest Clubhouse, a place that smelled of expensive wax and cowardice, with a panel of 3 board members who looked at me like I was a cockroach that had wandered into a wedding. Beatrice was there, of course, sitting in the front row with a smug look of victory, her lawyers shuffling papers that I knew were built on lies. They started their presentation, showing in quote, updated in quote, maps and talking about in quote, visual harmony in quote, and the end quote, unfortunate necessity of eminent domain for community preservation, end quote, acting as if they were doing me a favor by taking my life into Oppos. Let's work away. I let them talk for 20 minutes, let them dig their own graves with their expensive pens, and then I stood up. I didn't end Oppos. T have a lawyer. I just had Elias Thornbox. I walked up to the table and laid out the 1988 injunction, the one that carried the seal of the state superior court, and I watched the color drain from the board in Oppos. S faces as I showed them the metadata Arthur had found, the digital footprints of Beatrice and Oppos, as fraud. I looked her right in the eye and said, and quote, you didn't in Oppos. T just break the law, Beatrice. You try to steal a man in Oppos. S history, And the funny thing about history is that it's written in ink, not in the sand you try to shift whenever you get bored, end quote. The fallout was a landslide that buried Highland Crest in a week. The judge didn't end oppose. T just dismissed their claims. She referred the metadata tampering to the district attorney. And within a month, Beatrice was facing charges of felony document fraud and conspiracy. The board dissolved in a flurry of resignations and finger-pointing, and the end, quote, Highland Security, end quote. Team was disbanded after it came out they weren't into oppos. Even license guards, just thugs in khakis paid under the table. I went back to my cabin, back to the silence that was finally starting to feel like peace, and I did something I should have done a long time ago. I took that scorched blackened wall, the one they tried to burn, and I didn't in oppos, sand it down or paint it. I polished it. I treated that burnt wood with linseed oil until it shone like obsidian, a permanent scar that told the story of a house that refused to die. I branded a new sign, end quote, 1923, still here, end quote, and I bolted it over the burn mark with steel bolts that no fire could touch. People still paddle by sometimes, but they dawn into oppos, whisper anymore, and they certainly dawn into oppos. Drift too close to my dock. They see the scar on the wall and the man on the porch who doesn't into oppos. Look like he's looking for a fight, but looks like he's already won the only one that mattered. I think about Elias Thorne a lot, about how he held the line, so I could have a place to breathe, and it makes me wonder how many other people are sitting in houses right now, feeling the walls close in because someone with a title and a lawnmower decided they didn't end oppos. Belong. It's easy to think that if you play by the rules, you'll be safe, but the truth is the rules are often just a fence built by the people who want to keep the world small. Sometimes you have to be the one to kick the fence down, even if it means getting some smoke in your lungs and some dirt under your fingernails. So, I'm curious, have you ever had someone try to, end quote, correct, end quote, your life because it didn't end oppos? Fit their vision of perfection? Have you ever felt the weight of a community trying to crush your individuality under the guise of, end quote, harmony, end quote? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I've learned that the only thing more powerful than a lie is a person who refuses to let it become the truth. Let's talk about who really owns the view.